And so meeting ourselves where we're at is that part of knowing that we're all going to have hardships. We're all going to have situations that knock us down, and that the work is not getting rid of that part. The work is learning how to shift our relationship to those experiences, meeting ourselves where we're at, giving ourselves that space to be human, and to find the strength and thriving in what some people call, darkness or vulnerability, or, we tend to look at it culturally as our weaknesses.
Okay, so no, it's so heavy because for me, I look at it so different because I'm just like, I don't care that I'm human. Like, I need to get stuff done. I don't have time to look at the feelings and feel the feelings. Yeah. And you've always been one to be like, Cayla. And then your voice, I'm just like, okay, slow down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We all need those people in our lives. But there's a lot of people that maybe they think like nothing's wrong with my life. Are they in denial?
Well, again, I think it's that part of
it's what you do with your
it's
feelings.
what you
how
do
you
with
react
it,
with
right?
your feelings.
None of us gets to not have our feelings,
right?
And the feelings in and of themselves are not the problem. It's what we do with the feelings that are the problem. And what happens when we're go, and I don't have time to feel that, I can't slow down for this, it's gonna come up. Like, it is going to come up at some place, sometime, because we don't get to not have them. Feelings are a byproduct of the human experience. We don't get to avoid them, we don't get to not have them. It's just a matter of when and how they're going to come up.
It also means we get to have the good feelings too.
Absolutely.
Yes.
It's not
Absolutely.
a bad thing.
Absolutely. You don't.
I love feelings.
Yeah.
I love feelings. I like the good feelings. But I think for me, like, when I think about therapy, and I know you're also in the coaching space too, because I've referred so many of my like friends and colleagues to you because you coach high level people. Yeah. And I mean, I sing your praises all the time. And I think for me, like with therapy, I'm like, what's the difference? Because I feel like sometimes you just have, like, I know people, I'm like, you've been going to a therapist for a long time, talking about those feelings for a long time. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with therapy. I think it's great. But I'm just saying, like, when is it okay to go, enough is enough? Like, put your big girl pants on.
That's a good question, because some people do. They're in therapy forever.
I mean, you've probably worked with people. I know you can't say.
Yeah.
But,
well, and this is a big part of what sort of propelled me into more of the coaching space, because the healing process can take a very long time, especially when you're doing some of the really deep relational work, and that's where people tend to be in therapy for a long time, and
it's the triggers too.
It can be very repetitive. It can, and for me as someone too who I like to feel effective.
Yes.
Like when I'm sitting in that room sometimes with a client who has been going through this for a long time, I can sometimes come up against my powerlessness, and that doesn't always feel good. Whereas coaching, it's much more, it's short term. It is really concentrated. You are focusing on one area of your life, your business, to really target and get in depth on. And so it's really action oriented. Whereas again, therapy has more of that, you're just holding space for the healing process, which can be a lot slower. But I absolutely understand, and I get that point of, like, at what point do we say, okay, now we're just indulging the feeling and staying in the victimhood, but
instead of taking the action.
And this is where, again, we have to have that compassion for ourselves and meet ourselves where we're at, and know that it's a journey, it's a slow process, and sometimes we're just planting seeds, and those seeds are not going to sprout for years to come. It's like bamboo, I think, is one of them, where it's underneath the ground doing all its work for like 5 years it takes till it breaks through the surface, and then once it does, it just flourishes.
Blossoms.
And sometimes I think that's how therapy and the healing journey can be. It doesn't look like there's a lot happening.
Frustrating.
And if you have that, like, results, it can be very frustrating.
I want to talk about something personal with you, because I know, what happened to you when you were 10 years old. And would you share with the audience, like, a little bit about that? Because knowing that background, most people, they would have went down a much different path. But here you are, you're helping people every single day. You're ambitious. You're not letting your circumstance define you.
Yeah, so my story actually starts before I was 10. I always say it, I was born to two people who really had no business being parents yet. They were very young, and they were both very stuck in their own trauma and their own struggles. Both were addicts, and both had some depression that they were struggling with. And I knew at a very young age, probably I'd say 3 or 4, when I really started coming into and knowing that there was something different about not only my environment, but there was also something different about me. I was a very sensitive child. And then...
Did you live with them?
No. So
Okay.
I lived with my grandmother. And they were both there, but my grandmother was my primary caretaker until I was about 7, when I moved in with my mom, and my dad had a very typical 80s custody arrangement where I think it was like every other weekend and holidays, or every other Sunday.
Did you call it 80s custody?
80s custody arrangement.
Now it's 50-50,
Now it's 50-50.
right? Yeah. That's
Like
what
we're,
and yeah.
Yep.
Trust me.
But
She's in the same.
yeah, but back then it was, dads didn't. So my dad had custody every other Sunday and on the weekends when I moved in with my mom. And then it was right before my 10th birthday, my dad committed suicide.
Oh my God.
And, it was
How did you find out?
So I was actually, I remember that it was yesterday. I was at school and I was in 4th grade. We were watching a movie in class, and the phone rang in the class. My teacher answered it, and she hung up and told me that my mom was in the office and I was going home. And I had this had never happened in my life. My mom didn't even come to back to school nights. She didn't show up at school.
Yeah. So you knew instantly something wrong.
I knew. And we got into the car, and she kind of let on that there was something going on, but wouldn't tell me what it was. And I remember racking my brain, and I'm 9 years old, I don't know anything.
I have a 9-year-old, I can only imagine.
I had just had my softball tryouts, and then I was like, did something happen with softball? Did I not make the team? And I was trying to figure it out, and we got home, and I remember we went into my living room, we were sitting on the couch, and my grandmother came in at that point, my mom turning to my grandmother saying, how do I say this? How do I do this? And it was then that she told me that my dad had died. And truthfully, at that point, I was so young. It's a concept that I can't really explain to you how you make sense of it in a 9-year-old's mind.
Yeah.
You don't get it.
Because it wasn't even until a few days later when I was at my aunt's house, my dad's sister, that I even thought to ask how he died. I hadn't even, that wasn't part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember too going through a lot of emotions within myself of not really knowing what I was supposed to do with those feelings. It was I knew I was supposed to be sad, but it wasn't exactly, am I supposed to cry? And I remember sitting at his funeral even, and I wasn't crying. And then I was looking around and I saw my cousin, who was in high school at the time, and she was crying. And it was almost this oh my God, I'm supposed to be crying. And that was when it started. And
because
so
were you guys close?
My dad and I, again, he had custody of me every other Sunday.
So you don't spend a lot of time with
He
him.
wasn't my primary caretaker, and he had been, in the months previously, leading up to that point, he had been going through his own struggles. He was in a treatment center. He had called me, I remember this too, he had called me before going into a treatment center saying that he had a drug addiction. And again, I'm 9 years old, and I was like,
what are drugs?
Okay, Daddy. I had no idea what this meant, really. And I went to go visit him, and so there was a lot
How
of...
old were you when he said that's kind of interesting that he just was very honest with you and said,
Yeah.
"Look, Daddy has it."
That is interesting, because my dad never told me.
Yeah.
I mean, until I was 16 years old, they always tried to make it, and I'm like, I know why.
He was really trying to get help. And
he was ready to change.
He was, and it's interesting because he ended up actually committing suicide about a month after he got out of treatment, and which is more common than we might recognize, because sometimes it's, when you're really in the thick of it, you sometimes don't have the motivation to follow through on some of the things, whereas once things start to, you get a little bit more momentum under you, but you don't necessarily see things where you want them to be. That's kind of the hardest, most critical point for a lot of people. But that experience was probably one of the most defining moments in my life. And again, even at such a young age, I knew that there was a reason why this had happened. I didn't have the capacity at that point to put it into those words. But again, I knew at a young age that I had been given this path and this journey for a reason, that it was different than what I saw my
you look at all your,
no one else
where'd you grow up? I mean, you grew up in LA.
Yeah, so I grew up in LA. I actually grew up right down the street in Beverly Hills. At this point, I was still living in the South Bay. But moving to Beverly Hills when I was in middle school.
Grew up really fast.
Yeah, nobody else was going through things like this. And so I knew that there was something that I want to say separated, but that word doesn't necessarily feel best, because it wasn't so much about separating as it was just allowing me to connect to something that I knew made me special and made me unique. It also coupled with that part of me that's very sensitive, very intuitive. There was a reason why I was going through all of that.
You know, somebody listening, and they may have gone through exactly what you've gone through, you know, losing a loved one at an early age, or dealing with an addict. And you could either go one or two ways, like I said earlier, right? So it's like, what was it that made you realize this actually happened for me? This was my path. This was meant for good.
Yeah, you know, I love that question, and I wish I could say that there was one thing that happened, but it really was a culmination of years leading up to that. And you know, the truth is, at the time, anger fueled me. And
me too. Anger fueled me too. And is that a bad thing?
Anger fuels a lot.
Well, it got a lot of things done.
Okay, can you tell them what you say to this? Because you're like the coping mechanism thing.
What do I say? Which part?
Okay, I'll quote you right now. Your coping mechanisms work until one day they don't.
Until they stop working.
Yes, until they stop working.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's like anger works for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then you're plateaued.
These are survival mechanisms.
Yes.
And for me, what happened was, again, at a young age, you know, I looked around and I was like, oh, like my parents are a hot mess. And I decided very young, I'm not going to be that.
That was so me too.
I am not going to be that. Yeah. So I went in the other direction, and everything was perfect. And it looked good, and it sounded good.
So you became a perfectionist.
I was a perfectionist. I was what they call covert perfectionist. There's different layers of perfectionists, right? So you have the perfectionist that's like the type A,
right?
Outwardly, everything is perfect. And then you have like me, which is the covert perfectionist. I wouldn't do anything unless I knew I was going to be the best at it. Which, as a result, it showed up as me kind of not really caring about a lot of things, because if I wasn't I avoided failure at all costs. I refused, because
in your mind, what did failure mean to you?
It meant looking like my mom or my dad, and so I wouldn't do that. And I spent a lot of, so this fueled me. It got me into UCLA. It fueled my earning a doctorate. I got married. I had 2 beautiful children. I had everything looked great on the outside, and inside, I hated myself. I was never good enough. I really, you know, I was chasing a feeling. I was trying to fill an emptiness that was never going to be filled by anything outside of me.
And here you are, you're a therapist.
Absolutely.
What did you want to be when you were younger?
I actually wanted to be a teacher when I was younger, because my teachers were so impactful, and they were such a huge part of I bound all my anxiety through school. And I was always a teacher's pet. And
you're a forever learner.
I'm a forever learner. I loved school, but another part of my story that was really important to me was, you know, again, not being like my parents, I needed to make money. And I wasn't going to perpetuate the same poverty.
Oh, and if you're a teacher, you have no money.
And if you're a teacher, you don't make money. And so I needed to do something where I could make an impact, but I could also earn a good living. That was really important to me. And so that was kind of how
I love how you just own it too, because I'm the same way, where
it's a big part
of
my story.
Hey, I don't want to be poor.
Yeah.
So this is why I chose this.
It's a really important, honest, you know, and of course, like I had good intentions. I needed to do something where I could hold both, making an impact and making a good living, and those just made sense for me.
You shouldn't have to apologize for that either.
Yeah, but it was, so it was a very humbling moment for me when I realized that everything that I had done in an effort to be the exact opposite of my mom, I was just like her.
When was it that you figured it out in your career, that in your life? Where it just
for
hit
me,
a point where it was like, wait a minute, this
Yeah.
it's not aligning inside and outside.
It was about 8 years ago, right after I'd had my first child, after I'd had my son, and I was in that place where.
And you're married.
I'm married, and I have this very successful career at that point. And again, it all looks beautiful, but I'm so unhappy. I have a raging eating disorder, and I am.
How are you? This is like for me, looking outside, looking in. We've talked about this, but you know, it's like, are you out of integrity at some point? Because you're like, I'm helping these people, talking to them about their problems, and I'm over here, I'm a hot mess.
Right. So again, I think it's about also that piece of embracing my humanity, that
like,
knowing
I'm not perfect.
I'm not perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. I'm never going to be finished.
Right.
Right. I love saying, like, I am complete. We're all complete, but not yet finished. That I'm continuing to evolve. I'm continuing to work. And the other thing that I look at too is, you know, when you're on this journey of helping others, you don't have to be at the end. You just have to be one step ahead of another person to be able to turn around and offer your hand to them.
That's such a good point.
And, you know, for all of us, because we all have imposter syndrome, because there's none of us that like, it doesn't stop. Like, this journey never ends. But the integrity piece comes with that willingness to be honest, that willingness to
with
look
yourself.
at myself and say, you know what, like, I need help in this area. I'm struggling in this area. I am still acting out. Like, I had to come to the realization too that, you know, my dad's death, which I had never really processed because I was so young, had been driving so much of my decisions and my choices. And this part of me that felt unwanted, unloved, alone. Like, I
so
was
many
holding,
people feel like that.
Yeah, this belief, like, if only I was prettier, or I was smarter, or I was skinnier, then maybe my dad would have wanted to stick around. And I had to really go into that.
So you know,
what
this
is
not the true story.
Right.
You know that.
Well, and here's the thing too, is what's very interesting a lot of times for us is that we intellectually, we know something, but that space between our head and our heart, and where our beliefs and our emotions live, like our
it's
emotions.
Like, how come we can't connect it sometimes?
Because our emotions, the way that the brain is structured, if you want a little science lesson really quickly, the way that the brain is structured, our early primary memories and experiences live in our midbrain, which is where our amygdala and our hippocampus are. That's where our emotional core comes from. It's what drives our fight or flight response. All of that happens there. Our intellect, our knowing, our ability to rationalize a situation happens in our prefrontal cortex. It's a completely different part of the brain. And this part of the brain doesn't even really come online until about puberty. And it doesn't start developing until about 25, which was why for me and for so many young women, this growth and these changes start happening in our late 20s, when we have a better sense of who we are. But then we have to start making that connection then, not just knowing it intellectually, but creating the pathway into and finding ways to actually be in the emotional center of it.
Okay, so I know we got to wrap up, but there's one last thing I want you to share with everybody.
Yes.
And it's the analogy of the bus.
Yes. Okay. So right along these lines of what we're talking about right now, the way that I describe healing and the work that I do, again, oftentimes when we are going through this process and intellectually we know something, we tend to get very frustrated with ourselves for still being in that same place or doing the same things even when we know better.
I am a victim.
Right? We all are. And what happens is we're like, like, why am I still doing that? And
I know better.
I know better. And so the way that I describe it is imagining that we are all on a bus. We all have our own bus that we are driving down this road of life. And on this bus, we have our passengers, and everybody has their own passengers. My passengers are the little 4-year-old who is just starting to realize that something's not quite right with her family. She's a little bit different than others. I have the 7-year-old who's starting to feel really awkward and uncomfortable in her body. She's kind of a little bit chubby. She doesn't really feel very good. I have the 9-year-old whose dad just committed suicide, and she doesn't think she's good enough and all of that. And then there's the rebellious teenager who wants to just give a, giant F you to the world. And we all have these parts of us. And what happens when we're not paying attention is those passengers get in the driver's seat. And our work...
It's dangerous.
our work is to first learn to recognize who our passengers are and what it looks like when they're driving. And then 2, rather than trying to kick them off the bus, because no one's getting off this bus,
They're with you forever.
to create a new relationship. And that's where the healing happens. It's being able to make contact with that part of ourselves in a way that says, I see you, I know that you're here, you don't need to take over anymore, I got it.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
You know, this is that's the challenge for our viewers today. That's the call to action. Make sure you know who's driving your bus. I mean, it's very important.
Self-aware.
I love that analogy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Drive
having
your own
me.
bus today.
Yeah.
Right? All right, you guys, you can binge watch all of our episodes on Upgrade Your Life TV.